Wimbledon, a district of southeast London in England, where every summer it becomes a magnet for tourists. Since 1877, for 2 centuries, it hosts the oldest and most famous tennis tournament on earth, and the adrenaline is racing while finalists enter centre court to receive that metallic prize and fly back home as a winner. But as you walk away from the court to the famous Wimbledon Common, on the south of the Common is Cannizzaro Park that has beautiful landscape, greenery and ponds. But not far from the entrance of the park is a wooded area, and as you walk through it, there is a bust of a king who many give homage to and worship as a god. Who is it?
One by one, King Selassie, I the conquering lion.
Did you understand what this Jamaican reggae and recording artist Capleton said? I didn't think you would. But he mentioned King Selassie, the conquering lion. Why is the mortal receiving such praise? He is seconded by another Jamaican recording artist named Sizzla in the same song. Sizzla also mentions Selassie, but he also calls him Rastafari. In an isolated part of the park, standing alone, is a facial bust and torso of a man who once stayed in Wimbledon on these grounds as an asylum, while his home country, Ethiopia, was being invaded by the Italians led by Benito Mussolini. This king titled himself Haile Selassie, which means the power of the Trinity, and he was the last king or emperor of Ethiopia. If you speak to your average Ethiopian, they would tell you he was no different to any monarch they had previously. But to a group of men, he is not just revered, he is worshipped as God, who they also call Jah. And when he paid a visit to Jamaica, in the West Indies in the Caribbean, a group of men had already named themselves after him. His birth name was Tafari Makonnen Wode Mikael. The Ethiopian Amharic word Ras means head or prince or chief, and Rastafari is believed by this group of men as Jesus Christ incarnated. Where did these men get that idea from? From their own books, they believe that Selassie is a fulfillment of Bible prophecy, the second coming of Christ. So much to behold, every eye shall see him. But how did these men come to that conclusion? It was a product of a Jamaican man of Anglican stock, titled the First Rasta, Leonard Percival Howell, who wanted to racialize the gospel, declaring a mortal a god and turning an African king into the Messiah for the black race, declaring that Selassie was the lion of the tribe of Judah. The book of Revelation, written on the Isle of Patmos, mentions the Lion of the tribe of Judah in the 5th chapter, who opens the 7 seals, which is describing a history of the church. But this is an event that takes place in heaven, for a door was opened in heaven, not on earth. So Mr. Howell misapplied what the Bible was actually talking about. It was the late Jamaican reggae recording artist Robert Nesta Marley, better known as Bob, who popularized this peculiar movement onto the world stage that gave it global credibility. But in the West Indian community where it was born and spread, it seemed rather odd. Apart from the Benin Empire of Nigeria in West Africa, and the Nubian Empire of the Sudan in East Africa, where men had braided their hair, it was very alien and strange to see black men grow their hair long without combing it and leave it to grow wild like hippies, where they will also wear turbans on their heads, and to make things even worse, inhale smoke into their lungs by burning the plant cannabis, turning it into ganja and robbing it of its medicinal properties. Where did this strange phenomenon come from? It is from the Sadhu, who far precede the Rastas. They are Hindu ascetics or mystics who practice yoga, whose origins date back to the BC era, who wear turbans on their heads, grow dreadlocks, and who also smoke marijuana, especially during a Hindu festival in honor of the god Shiva. So these customs can be traced to Hinduism. What is interesting is that Haile Selassie never grew his hair long, and there is no record of him smoking weed. But while he was staying in Wimbledon, chilling with the aristocracy of the UK, the Italians were arming men in the north of his country, in what is now called Eritrea, in an attempt to fully submerge the only African country that was not colonized by Europeans, Ethiopia. But it was a country that was not to be easily walked over, and many of its most bravest warriors were not men, but women, who fought teeth and nails, sometimes barefoot, to preserve the heritage of their country. While Selassie was in England, another man in England who once highly respected him turned on him, and in 1937 blasted him and called him a coward for abandoning his people. This man is little known today, but his signed letters are on sale for almost $7,000 online. He led the largest mass movement of black people in history, and his influence was so strong that a young revolutionary Vietnamese attended his lectures in Harlem and learned from him about colonialism. His name was Ho Chi Minh, who took these revolutionary ideas to his native country in his struggle against the French, the United States government and the Saigon government, and he created the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, becoming its first president and prime minister that provoked the infamous Vietnam War. This man's influence posed a threat to not only the colonial powers, but to the United States, who developed a whole agency whose bureau grew and expanded as a result of closely surveillancing his movement, infiltrating it with carefully trained men to destroy it. In Brixton in South London, there is a road named after him. In Haringey in North London, there is a library named after him, and the British Labour MP leader Jeremy Corbyn campaigned for it to remain open. And in Kensington Olympia in West London, there is a park named after him, for it was in London, England, that he developed his ideas that led to a Pan-African philosophy to inspire a global mass movement. Who is this man called Marcus Mosiah Garvey Jr.? And what impact has he left on the Black conscious movement? We shall explore his philosophy during this study. Imagine you've been raised in a very solid Christian home. You've had a good upbringing and your faith is quite strong. But then all of a sudden, you've been challenged. Someone says to you, look mate, you see religion? It's a load of rubbish. It's all about control, stealing your money, and it's man-made. And by the way, you're actually following a white man's religion. You pray to and worship a white Jesus, and you read a book called the Bible, which is a white man's book. This is a challenge that many have been confronted with in the black community. And we're going to deal with that challenge at the end of this study. But this study is going to cover the life of a man by the name of Marcus Mosiah Garvey and the influence he has had on the world. But before we go into his lifestyle, I'm going to show you how England has been the home of many revolutionary ideas, including many isms that includes Pan-Africanism. This study is going to cover many areas that many may find very sensitive. So I encourage you to fasten your seatbelts because the ride is going to get quite bumpy. England is a tiny weeny dot on the planet, but it has had one of the greatest influences on the modern world, and for a place so small, it is hard to believe that its influences have covered the globe. In the city of London is the famous St. Bartholomew's Hospital known as Barts, that was founded in 1123 AD, and on one of its gates is the godfather of the Brexit movement, King Henry VIII, who separated England from the continent of Europe in 1534. His daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, whose statue is engraved on London's Harrow School in northwest London, continued the struggle of her father, and the naval war against Spain put Britain on the map as a rising dominant world power, where in Plymouth there is a plaque in honour of her expanding the English Empire by Sir Humphrey Gilbert, the English soldier, adventurer, and Member of Parliament. But England was also going to influence the world via the field of science, with two deep conflicting worldviews. Inside of London's Westminster Abbey are the buried remains of two men who have both shaped how we view religion, race, sexuality, and politics. Sir Isaac Newton was a genius. This Cambridge-educated mathematician, astronomer, and physicist, as his own words said, stood on the shoulders of giants and gave us a clear understanding of the laws of gravity, where he laid the foundation of classical mechanics, contributed to the laws of optics, and through his telescopic lens made us understand how the universe functions and how the heavens work. He documented his finds in his famous Principia, but he was to encounter an idea that was to resurface in the 20th century. Many people see the Big Bang as a theory that was compiled in the 1930s that teaches that a huge explosion brought our Earth into being. But this was an idea that existed in Newton's day. In the notebook Under of God, he wrote, "Were men and beasts, etc., made by fortuitous jumblings of the atoms, there would be many parts useless in them. Here a lump of flesh, there a member too much. Some kinds of beasts might have had one eye, some more than two." But he concluded in his Principia that God is the same God, always and everywhere. In him are all things contained and moved. You see, when Newton looked up to the heavens, he was in awe and knew that every color, molecule, and shape was designed by God for his glory, for man to observe and glorify his creator. But another scientist buried in the same building wanted to counteract that idea, and instead of giving God the glory, he wanted to give man the glory and return man back to the worship of nature. Charles Darwin, like Sir Isaac Newton, was educated at the University of Cambridge. He was a keen observer and fascinated with nature and the origins of life. He was blown away at giant tortoises at the Galapagos Island when he paid there a visit, and it intrigued his curiosity. But he wanted to remove God out of the picture. His friend Alfred Russel Wallace came to the same conclusion as Darwin. And Herbert Spencer, who coined the phrase the survival of the fittest, also came to the same conclusion and spread Darwin's ideas. Ernst Haeckel, the biologist, naturalist, physician, and professor, spread Darwinism in Germany. And Asa Gray spread Darwin's views of natural selection in the United States, but he differed to Darwin on God. This letter was written in 1880 from Charles Darwin to a fan, and it declares his worldview. He said, "I am sorry I have to inform you that I do not believe in the Bible as a divine revelation, and therefore not in Jesus Christ as the Son of God." So he wrote a book titled The Origin of Species in 1859. But as you open it, it is actually titled The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, a blatant promotion of racial superiority. So who are these apparently lower races? England was also the home and the development of photography, where Thomas Wedgwood was one of the first pioneers in this modern phenomenon. Herbert Baysdale was an Australian who was one of the few who championed for better treatment of Australian Aborigines. He took photographs of them and penetrated into areas and communities that most whites had not even heard of. And even if they seemed or looked primitive to the European colonists and settlers, he disagreed with their mistreatment. But there was a reason for his dismay. These Australian Aborigines were forced off their land by white settlers and used for an exhibition, and as you can see, they do not look impressed, and there is a reason. French Prince Roland Napoleon Bonaparte was an anthropological photographer whose grandfather was the brother of Emperor Napoleon. He took some photographs in 1885 of Australian Aborigines that was to reinforce Darwin's ideas. Jenny on the right, her son Toby in the middle, and Billy on the left are described in the pamphlet on the right as ranting man-eaters, veritable bloodthirsty beasts in distorted human form, and the last line reads, the lowest order of man. But they weren't the only ones to be treated in an inhumane manner. The businessman Maurice Maitre is standing on the left, with the Selkman or owner tribe who were forcefully brought to this exhibition in 1889 to prove that they were an inferior race. They had no chiefs. Everybody was one. They were a very peace-loving people situated in Tierra del Fuego in Argentina, who were very similar to the Aborigines in their simplicity of life, body paint and their nudity. Their only item of clothing was the fur of the hunted guanaco, and a few American explorers such as Frederick Alfred Cook and Charles Wellington Furlong studied them, photographed them, and respected their culture. But just as the English wiped out the indigenous Aborigines of Tasmania by war and disease in the 19th century, the Ona were to experience a similar fate, where they were also wiped out completely, driven off the face of the earth and officially extinct by 1910. It was Julius Popper, a Romanian-born Argentinian explorer of a Jewish family, and Ramon Lister, an Argentinian-born soldier and explorer who led this genocidal ethnic cleansing program starting in the 19th century. But what inspired their total disregard for this people? It can be traced to the works of Charles Darwin in his 1839 book, The Voyage of the Beagle. Darwin met this group in the cold region of Argentina, sketched them, and described how their culture worked. He said the perfect equality among the individuals composing the Fuegian tribes must for a long time retard their civilization. At present, even a piece of cloth given to one is torn into shreds and distributed, and no one individual becomes richer than the other. This is how he described the Fuegians, but then his racial superiority takes precedence when he saw that many of them walked naked in the cold. I will describe our first arrival in Tierra del Fuego. I could not have believed how wide was the difference between savage and civilized man. Viewing such men, one can hardly make oneself believe that they are fellow creatures and inhabitants of the same world. The Australian comes nearest to Fuegian. Now you can see why both the Aborigines of Australia and the Fuegians of Argentina were viewed as the lowest order of man. But why drive the latter to extinction and murder some of the former to be used for research in London Natural History Museum? Charles Darwin in his Origin of Species said, "Seeing that no one can solve the simple problem why of two races of savages, one has risen higher in the scale of civilization than the other, and this apparently implies increased brain power. Natural selection will preserve and thus separate all the superior individuals, allowing them freely to intercross, and will destroy all the inferior individuals." Darwin's zealous apologists will say, look, he's talking about animals, but please read the title of the book. He was talking about man, and men would parade non-Europeans who had blatant deformities, but they would say that they were the missing link. And human zoos all over Europe and America would show caged human beings on display in order to prove the theory of evolution. And you can clearly tell the difference between Newtonian science and Darwinian science, especially when unscientific charts by Ernst Haeckel are turned into a reality, when a Congolese man by the name of Otto Benga was on display in a zoo in New York in an attempt to prove that the black African was the missing link between monkey and man. And this pseudoscience that started in England has spread all over the world, and man still thinks he is descended from some creature in the primordial soup, which is so ridiculous. But Darwin is still revered, as in the video game Assassin's Creed, where he is portrayed as this brilliant innovator of human thought. But his ideas were to also inspire another man who came to England, Karl Marx, who also had one of the most powerful influence on the 20th century, including the field of economics and on how a state should be run. Marx, a German Jew, was baptized a Lutheran, but somewhere on his journey through reading the writings of Friedrich Hegel and Ludwig Feuerbach, he became disillusioned with religion. But his 1848 book Communist Manifesto, if read carefully, does promote equality in a modern society. His ideas have still influenced communist guerrillas such as FARC in Colombia, the oldest insurgency army in the world that has taken part in the largest civil war in the world, and Marxist guerrillas in the Philippines, who, like the Colombians, have also been waging war against the state since the 1960s. China in Asia has also been dominated by Marxism throughout most of the 20th century, leading into the 21st, where it dominated every aspect of that republic. But while Marx is revered by many for being a voice of the downtrodden, he was actually bankrolled by a fellow German and by the very system he was opposed to. When you come out of Chalk Farm Station in northwest London, when you turn right then left and walk over a bridge, you'll end up in Regent's Park Road. And there is a house, and the man who once lived there was Karl Marx's close associate and co-writer, businessman Friedrich Engels, who secretly funded Marx by the profits made in the factories in Manchester in England that was exploiting the working class. Karl Marx lived on Maitland Park Road, around a 10-minute walk from Engels and a left from Chalk Farm Station, and a second left as you go up the hill and a second road on the right. This was Karl Marx's last home where he lived and where he died. And it was in North London, in the famous Highgate Cemetery, that you have to pay to enter into, where his body was laid to rest in a very expensive mausoleum in London, in England. But when he lived in London, England, by Piccadilly Circus in Soho, this is where this German immigrant developed his revolutionary ideas, where he would spend hours just down the road in the British Library that was then in London's British Museum, where he wrote his next book, Das Kapital, that was actually co-written by Engels. So it was in London, England, where communism's ideology developed and was spread. Karl Marx was also a heavy drinker and would spend his time in this pub, the Water Rats, and inside of the pub there is a photo of him, but underneath this photo was apparently another regular in the pub, Russian revolutionary Vladimir Lenin. Around the corner on Percy Circus in the London borough of Islington once lived Vladimir Lenin in 1905. He also lived in Tavistock Place, a 5-10 minute walk from Russell Square Station, while he was in exile in 1908. And a 10-minute walk from his home, he would also spend hours in the British Library, where he discovered the writings of Karl Marx, and he would write articles in Clerkenwell Green in this building, a 50-minute walk from Barbican Station, today called the Marx Memorial Library. And it was in London, England, that developed the seeds of the Russian Revolution. But who financed Lenin to topple the Tsar during the Russian Revolution? This is one of the most controversial episodes of modern human history. This is a photo of Robert Minor, a leading member of the American Communist Party and a political cartoonist. This cartoon he drew in 1911 portrays a bearded Karl Marx in the front center with socialism tucked under his arm, being congratulated by the financial elite. From left to right, there is George W. Perkins, J.P. Morgan, Teddy Roosevelt, and John D. Rockefeller Sr. standing on the far right, with Wall Street decorated with red flags and a cheering crowd. What does that mean? Did this artist have some insight? John Piermont Morgan was a famous American banker and financier whose monopoly once had a financial hold over Wall Street and the US economy. Described as America's greatest banker, he spent some time in London, England, and though he died in 1913, his colossus legacy was to have an everlasting effect on the financial world. And the economic big boys on Wall Street were to bankroll revolutions, and these dead presidents were to be utilized by American financier William Boyce Thompson, who was to make Lenin's revolution a reality, where he influenced Alfred Milner, an Oxford-educated British statesman who shaped British foreign and domestic policy. This is documented in the book titled Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution by the late British-American economist and historian Anthony Cyril Sutton. Solid journalism is very hard to get today. Men seek for popularity and fame instead of searching for hard truths and solid facts, and today's generation is fed with scandals and fast food information that dumbs down the brain and pushes true intellectual scholarly work into the dump heap. But the declassified files of the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, where Anthony C. Sutton worked, the files of the US State Department, the files of the American Red Cross organization that highlighted Raymond Robbins, a front for the organization, London's National Archives with intelligence cables from the British War Cabinet under British Intelligence Chief Sir Basil Hulme Thompson, and the autobiography of British diplomat and secret agent Sir Robert Hamilton Bruce Lockhart. Conflicts with the accounts of George Kennan, the US diplomat to Russia, who deleted facts about the banker's role in the Bolshevik Revolution that included the Swiss bank Naya Banken and the Swiss banker Olaf Ashberg, along with Wall Street financiers, bankrolled Lenin into power. Anthony C. Sutton documented all. Where the United States could have exerted its dominant influence to bring about a free Russia, it truckled to the ambitions of a few Wall Street financiers who, for their own purposes, could accept a centralized Tsarist Russia or a centralized Marxist Russia, but not a decentralized free Russia. It was J.P. Morgan and the American international corporations that attempted to control both domestic and foreign revolutionaries in the United States for their own purpose. William Boyce Thompson is an unknown name in the 20th century, yet Thompson played a crucial role in the Bolshevik Revolution. A letter from J.P. Morgan to the State Department, 861.51/190, confirmed that Morgan cabled 425,000 rubles to Thompson at his request for the Russian Liberty Loan. Raymond Robbins joined the 1917 American Red Cross mission to Russia as a social economist. Robbins made no bones about his support for the Bolsheviks. Defeating Germany and inhibiting German exploitation of Russia was the argument used by W.B. Thompson and Raymond Robbins. The Wall Street Project in Russia in 1917 used the Red Cross mission as its operational vehicle. The American Red Cross mission, or perhaps we should call it the Wall Street mission to Russia, was financed by William B. Thompson, described in the official Red Cross circular as Commissioner and Business Manager, Director, United States Federal Bank of New York. In 1914, Thompson became the first full-term director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the most important bank in the Federal Reserve System. Thompson's contribution to the Bolshevik cause was recorded in the contemporary American press. The Washington Post of February 2, 1918 carried the following paragraphs. William B. Thompson, who was in Petrograd from July until November last, has made a personal contribution of $1 million to the Bolshevik for the purpose of spreading their doctrine in Germany and Austria. Lord Milner in England provides the transatlantic example of banking interests, recognizing the virtues and possibilities of Marxism. Milner was a banker, influential in British wartime policy and pro-Marxist. Milner had a former British consul in Russia, Bruce Lockhart, ready and waiting in the wings. Lockhart was briefed and sent to Russia with instructions to work informally with the Soviets. British War Cabinet papers now available record that British policy was diverted towards the Lenin-Trotsky regime by the personal intervention of Thompson with Lloyd George in December 1917. The British Prime Minister who met with William Thompson in 1917 was not a free agent. Lord Milner was the power behind the scenes. So Leon Trotsky standing on the right and Vladimir Lenin standing on the box on the left were bankrolled by the international bankers with full complicit support of the British government. And this is documented from official declassified state papers in the United States and in the United Kingdom. But both Lenin and Marx were not the only foreigners to find asylum and develop their craft in England and influence people's worldview. An Austrian neurologist, the father of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud by name, found asylum in England to continue his erotic philosophy. Most of his ideas are rejected today, but as a Jew in 1938, he had to flee from another fellow Austrian, a painter turned dictator, Adolf Hitler, who, like the Bolsheviks in Russia, was financed and supported by the international banking cartel. This was documented in another book by Anthony C. Sutton, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, where US oilman Walter C. Teagle, the head of Standard Oil New Jersey, today called ExxonMobil and Esso, supplied the oil that fueled Hitler's ships, tanks, jeeps, planes, and cars, and the classified documents that are openly available to the public are now revealing that there were portions of corporate America that propelled Adolf Hitler into power. When Americans say they helped to end the Second World War, they should also say they helped to make it happen. English bankers, a small clique within the Bank of England, also played a role in assisting the Nazis. But this was in secret without Parliament consent. So war is indeed a business. And this is why Sigmund Freud fled to northwest London, about a 10 to 15 minute walk from London's Finchley Road station, where he was able to live in peace until he died in 1939. And his house is now a museum. Being a Jew, he was buried in a Jewish era, Golders Green, in one of the most famous burial sites in England, Golders Green Crematorium, the final resting place to many famous people in the UK. The horror genre that revived that ancient superstition of fear was developed by a man whose remains are in here, who created people's fascination with vampires, the most famous being Count Dracula, a novel written by Irish author Bram Stoker. His cremated remains are in an urn along with his sons, and in another room are the ashes of Sigmund Freud with his wife's in this ancient Greek vase that was among his private collection in his house. So England, especially London, has become the home and asylum of many revolutionary ideas in theology and in science, and many different isms that include Freudism, Marxism, and Darwinism. But it also became the home of another ism, Pan-Africanism, and there is a monument in London's Westminster dedicated to the Anti-Slavery Society. There are a number of coins in English museums that show the abolition of slavery in English plantation colonies. And even though many English men championed for slavery to end, what is not known and is downplayed is that these abolitionists were actually driven and inspired by black Africans themselves. A 10 to 15 minute walk from this monument, you will come to London's Foreign Office, the department of the government of the United Kingdom that is responsible for promoting and protecting British interests worldwide. Inside the grounds is a plaque dedicated to a man who was born on a slave ship but who was eventually freed and lived among the English aristocracy. In Greenwich Park in South London, behind the famous Meridian line of Greenwich Observatory, is a wall with two plaques, and the one on the right has Ignatius Sancho's name engraved on it, and a few lines of his life and his role in opposing the slave trade. He was quite fortunate and privileged as he moved within English aristocratic circles that included his friends from left to right, British peer John Montagu, who financed his education, Lawrence Sterne, Irish novelist, Anglican clergyman and abolitionist, and the famous landscape painter Thomas Gainsborough, who painted a picture of his friend Ignatius Sancho. Being an influential black figure in the 1700s in England, he would also mentor and be a guide and support for blacks who lived in England, including those who had the privilege of living in aristocratic circles. In the Museum of London in the Docklands, upstairs on the top floor, is a copy of his famous letters, the book that was often cited at anti-slavery meetings alongside another book, the 1789 interesting narrative of Olaudah Equiano, an autobiography written by a Nigerian-born Igbo who was kidnapped as a slave, brought his freedom, baptized in London's Westminster Abbey, and who also became a leading abolitionist. The seeds of Pan-Africanism were being developed on English soil, and an English reporter who was sent to cover the arrival of Caribbean immigrants in the 1940s extended his studies and wrote a 632-page well-documented book in 1984 titled Staying Power. And the writer Peter Fryer said that Pan-Africanism, one of the major political traditions of the 20th century, was largely created by black people living in Britain. In 1787, Otobo Kawano published his thoughts and sentiments on the evil and wicked traffic of the slavery and commerce of the human species. 2 years later, Kawano's friend Olaudah Equiano published in London his interesting narrative. These two writers together anticipated many of the leading ideas of Pan-Africanism, that includes racial solidarity and self-awareness, Africa for the Africans, opposition to racial discrimination, emancipation from white supremacy and domination. With their works began the prehistory of Pan-Africanism, or in other words, the history of Proto-Pan-Africanism. Why was Britain the womb of the movement? Chiefly because it was the center of a fast-expanding empire. It was here that Africans, West Indians, Afro-Americans and Anglo-Africans could most conveniently meet, exchange ideas, create networks of contacts. And when the time was ripe to organize, it was here that they could most easily launch a movement that challenged the whole imperialist system. A Pan-African conference convened in London in July 1900 was due above all to the work and vision of yet another neglected pioneer, the Trinidadian Henry Sylvester Williams. By April 1900, the Pan-African Conference Committee had adopted the motto, Light and Liberty. The committee included Williams as General Secretary. It was in reports of this meeting that the British press first used the term Pan-Africanism. The association held that it was time for black people to develop their own talent and energy. Their efforts should be directed to the education of the young so as to bring forth the prolific possibilities of the race. The association believed that black people should develop their own chroniclers and set up our own libraries and organizations. The Reverend Henry Smith, who lived in London, forecast a grand and glorious future for Africans and warned against letting differences in the various shades of color of black people interfere with their progress. They should all work together. At the first Pan-African Conference in London in 1900, the meeting outlined their aims. Number 1. To secure Africans throughout the world true civil and political rights. Number 2. To ameliorate the conditions of our brothers on the continent of Africa, America, and other parts of the world. Number 3. To promote efforts to secure effective legislation and encourage our people in educational, industrial and commercial enterprise. Number 4. To foster the production of writing and statistics relating to our people everywhere. Number 5. To raise funds for rewarding these purposes. Just around the corner from London's St. James Park station is a building that was once the meeting place for radical ideas. Westminster Town Hall later changed to Caxton Hall. It was in this building that the first Pan-African Conference took place in 1900 in London, England. The man who organised it lived just off Edgware Road. His name was Henry Sylvester Williams, and this is a plaque in memory of him of where he once lived. This Trinidadian-born lawyer and intellectual was the brains and mastermind behind the first Pan-African Conference, where he united blacks from all over the world in order to better the conditions of themselves. On London's Harrow Road was once the health practice of another Trinidadian who attended the conference. His name was Dr. John Alcindor, another deep intellectual. He was a member of the Committee of the National Council for Combating Venereal Disease and the Anti-Tuberculosis Society. From the United States were members of the Afro-American Council. In the front row in the bottom center is Booker T. Washington, Bishop Alexander Walters, and Ida B. Wells. Behind Alexander Walters on the right is W.E.B. Du Bois. Two of these four attended the meeting. Alexander Walters, the 24th Bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, chair of the first Pan-African Congress in 1900. W.E.B. Du Bois, a member of the NAACP, who became the leading voice of African Americans after the death of Booker T. Washington, was also in attendance. The Fisk Jubilee Singers was a famous choir that sang melodies all around the world. Its choir leader standing in the center, Frederick Jeremiah Loudon, was another delegate from the United States at that conference. From the UK in attendance is the man who is on the centre of this monument in Croydon in South London. His name was Samuel Coleridge Taylor. He studied the violin at the Royal College of Music that is located in South Kensington. Today, he is forgotten, one of Britain's unsung heroes, but this composer was a musical genius. Though shy, this man, whose mother was white English and his father a black from Sierra Leone in West Africa, met President Theodore Roosevelt. He taught at the Trinity College of Music as well as an appointed professor at the Crystal Palace of Music. He had his own choir in the United States, the Coleridge Taylor Society, where he is seated with arms folded in the center. His close friend was African-American poet Paul Laurence Dunbar, who he met in 1896, the year Dunbar wrote the poem We Wear the Mask, describing the outward smile African-Americans wear that conceals a deep torment in the heart from the pain and suppression from the after effects of slavery. Samuel Coleridge Taylor put many of Paul Laurence Dunbar's poems to song and co-worked with Booker T. Washington to complete them. He lived most of his life in Croydon in South London, and he worked with another Brit who attended the meeting also, John Richard Archer, who lived in Battersea in South London. They both attended a Pan-African Conference and were very racially conscious, though both of their mothers were white, but they believed in the Pan-African vision. This painting is in London's British Museum, and it shows the Battle of Adwa in 1896 in Ethiopia, where the Ethiopians under Emperor Menelik defeated the Italians. Though the narrator has no documented evidence, it is said that Haiti's ambassador to Ethiopia, Benito Sylvain, supplied the funds to assist the Ethiopian army, and this Haitian diplomat was also a representative from the Caribbean at the Pan-African Conference. At this meeting, Africans didn't see blacks of the diaspora as uneducated, godforsaken slave babies. West Indians from the Caribbean community were not fighting over small island, big island. African Americans did not come with the superior house Negro mentality, thinking that they are the greatest gift to the black race since the days of the pharaohs. This was true black consciousness in its purest form, where differences were set aside and they needed to help each other in order to better the advancement of the black race. The idea was good, but it didn't develop. But one man was to pay a visit to London, England, a number of years after that meeting, and he was going to take the Pan-African Conference plans to a whole new level. What people dreamed of, he was going to turn into a reality. In the London newspaper, The Telegraph, when reviewing a book on the life of Marcus Garvey, it said that it was London, not Harlem or Kingston, that really made Marcus Garvey. In the months before the outbreak of the First World War, the imperial capital was buzzing with ideas of national awakening and Pan-African unity. A universal racist congress had already taken place before Garvey even arrived. So none of Marcus Garvey's ideas were original, but he wanted to develop a Pan-African vision where blacks totally depended upon each other with no outside help, as this recording of his confirms.
Any leadership that teaches you to depend upon another race is a leadership that will enslave you. Any leadership that teaches you to depend upon another race is a leadership that will enslave you.
So what drove this man to attempt to create a Hamitic utopia? What was the climate like in the post-slavery world, and what ideologies were then driving men's thinking? Darwinism gave racism scientific credibility. It put one race higher than all the others, calling one civilized and the others as savages. These ideas were embraced by Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, an English Victorian statistician who coined the phrase eugenics. He viewed blacks as being far more intellectually inferior to whites, and these ideas were also embraced by the European aristocracy, as you can see in this photo, where Kaiser Wilhelm, the German emperor who was drawn into the First World War, is at a human zoo where blacks are on display as inferiors. Marcus Garvey wanted to change that perception and give blacks a level of respect he thought they deserved. And unlike other blacks at that time, he financed himself and was very well travelled. You see, travelling does expand your thinking. He saw the conditions of his fellow Jamaicans, and he wondered if blacks in other parts of the world were in a similar position. So he travelled to places like Costa Rica in Central America, that is geographically situated between the Caribbean and the Pacific, and he conducted open-air lectures with huge crowds, encouraging blacks on how to better themselves as a race. He visited the only English-speaking country in Central America, Belize, and saw that they were in a similar position to blacks in Jamaica and Costa Rica. He also paid a visit to Panama and saw that black West Indian workers were one of the major driving forces that helped to build the famous Panama Canal. This troubled Garvey, and he wanted to do something about it. In the 1973 Encyclopedia Britannica, Volume 10, it gives an analysis of his goals and what he wanted to accomplish. Marcus Mosiah Garvey, organizer of the most important nationalistic movement among Negroes, which, reaching its peak of influence in the 1920s, once again gained currency and popularity in the late 1960s among some Negroes disillusioned by the slow progress of integration. From the platform of Liberty Hall in Harlem, which the UNIA brought in 1919, Garvey spoke of a new Negro who was proud of being black. The term black and proud is from Marcus Garvey. He reached the height of his power in 1920 when he presided at a convention in Liberty Hall with delegates from 25 countries. By 1919, Garvey claimed a membership of 2 million, though the exact number of the UNIA was never clear, but it is certain that he established what was the largest mass movement among Negroes until his time and beyond. So no one has ever accomplished what he did, and it was in London, England that he developed his skill, for as a printer and journalist by trade, he would write articles for journalist Dost Muhammad Ali's magazines, the African Times and Orient Review, the first political journal produced by and for black people ever published in Britain. He would also do lectures mostly in West London, to promote his ideas and to win people over to his Pan-African vision. He educated himself in Birkbeck, the University of London, where he studied law and philosophy, and is among one of their most famous alumni. And a 10-minute walk from this campus, like Marx and Lenin, he expanded his thinking, where he would spend hours among the second largest book collection in the world after the Library of Congress in the United States, in the British Library that was then in the British Museum, that is now situated in London's King's Cross. His Pan-African worldview was shaped by the writings of Edward Wilmot Blyden, the Liberian ambassador to the UK who was born in the US Virgin Islands in the West Indies, who has been titled as the father of Pan-Africanism. Dr. Joseph Robert Love, a Bahamian-born Haitian doctor, educated in New York, who was a journalist in Jamaica, was a mentor and a major influence of Marcus Garvey. But the book that changed his whole worldview while in the British Library was Up From Slavery by Booker T. Washington, and Garvey was so impressed that he contacted Booker T. Washington and they arranged to meet up and have a meeting, but Booker T. suddenly died in 1915 before they could ever meet. Who is Booker T. Washington? After emancipation and Reconstruction in the United States, Booker T. Washington, who was born a slave, educated himself and saw the supreme power in education and in something many blacks today in the West are renowned for running away from: reading books. He believed that a solid education and learning agriculture were in the best interests of blacks to progress. For if they had their own property and cultivated their own lands, then they would not have to be dependent upon the government and the state for their food if they were planting it themselves. He founded and became the first president of the Tuskegee Institute and was bankrolled by the man who was seated next to him on the right, Scottish-American industrialist billionaire Andrew Carnegie, who donated $20,000 to erect a new library. The richest man in US history, billionaire John D. Rockefeller Sr., also donated money to Tuskegee and the development of the institution, and Booker T. Washington also became an advisor and a good friend of Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the 26th President of the United States, as well as other presidents, where he became the leading voice of the African American community. He recruited scientist and inventor George Washington Carver that gave Tuskegee an intellectual edge, and Carver, on the bottom row, would give Bible studies to spiritually enrich the students' growth and teach students the depth of science and botany so that they were equipped for the real world. In his day, and to this very day, African Americans label Booker T. Washington as a sellout for depending upon white corporate America, but his critics had not even come near to what he accomplished. Garvey was an admirer of Booker T, but he wanted to create a movement that was totally independent, where there was no outside help, so that whites could not say they cannot accomplish anything without our help. So Garvey's second wife, Amy Jacks Garvey, rescued his ideas and writings, put all of his notes together, and presented to the public the vision of her husband. Marcus Garvey said, "I was born in the island of Jamaica, British West Indies, on August 17, 1887. My parents were black Negroes. I became a printer's apprentice at an early age while attending school. I saw the injustice done to my own race. I went traveling to South and Central America and parts of the West Indies to find out if it was so elsewhere, and I found the same situation. I set sail for Europe to find out if it was different there. I read of the conditions in America. I further learned of the horrors of native life in Africa. I asked, where is the black man's government? Where is his king and his kingdom? Where is his president, his country and his ambassador, his army, his navy, his men of big affairs? I could not find them, and then I declared I will help to make them." I read Up From Slavery by Booker T. Washington, and then my doom, if I may so call it, of being a race leader dawned upon me in London after I had travelled throughout almost half of Europe. I boarded a ship at Southampton for Jamaica, where I arrived on July 15, 1914. The Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities Imperial League was founded and organized 5 days after my arrival, with a program of uniting all the Negro peoples of the world into one great body to establish a country and government absolutely their own. I got in touch with Booker Washington and told him what I wanted to do. He invited me to America and promised to speak with me in the southern states to help my work. Although he died in the fall of 1915, I made my arrangements and arrived in the United States on March 23, 1916. At the start of World War I, when the entire planet was drawn into a European conflict and human beings were butchering each other mercilessly in the trenches, Marcus Garvey created a movement that was to leave a deep imprint on the world. This was at a time when there was no television, radio was in its infancy, aeroplanes were only limited to pilots during the war, and the only way of travelling was by sea, foot, or by rail. And with these limitations, Marcus Garvey was able to communicate his message to millions of blacks all over the world. Not with the wireless digital technology we have today that is connected by satellites, but by a trade that catapulted the Protestant Reformation, the printing press. And this was a skill Garvey specialized in, for it was his trade. In the midst of a political storm, the red, black and green flag of the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, was born. Karl Marx was bankrolled by the capital of Manchester factories, whose labels from the working class by his friend and businessman Friedrich Engels to spread his ideas. Vladimir Lenin was financed by the gazillions of Wall Street and Swiss bankers to accomplish the Russian Revolution. Marcus Garvey was supported by black civilians in Canada, North America, Central America, South America, the West Indies, Europe, and maybe in Africa. Many of their fathers and grandfathers were slaves on the plantations, for they invested into his idea. James Van Der Zee was a famous Harlem photographer who worked with Garvey with this phenomenon from England to capture and share to the world this growing movement. It looked like Garvey's dream was turning into a reality. Garvey looked invincible, unstoppable. His empire he wanted to create looked like it was going to work. The only problem was, without consulting the natives of Africa, he announced the Empire of Africa in 1921, appointing himself provisional president while creating the Universal African Legion, Universal Black Cross Nurses, Black Eagle Flying Corps, Knights of the Nile, and other orders. With huge rallies in Harlem in New York, it was something no one had ever seen before, and it was this movement of Garvey's that helped to inspire the Harlem Renaissance, the name given to the cultural, social, and artistic movement of artists, musicians, photographers, poets, and scholars. While many African Americans saw Garvey as an outsider and his views as very alien, as noted previously, his ideas were not original. A Harvard-educated African American radical, Martin Delany, was one of the first to speak of Africa for the Africans. But Marcus Garvey attempted to rebuild a whole continent, a daring project, but he still pressed forward. He created a shipping line in 1919, the Black Star Line Incorporated, for he was tired of the second-class treatment blacks experienced while on board ships, and he purchased a number of ships, renamed them after black heroes and heroines, and the entire crew of the Black Star Line was predominantly black, where they would sail throughout the Americas and also, eventually, to Africa. He also sent a delegation to the League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations, at Geneva in 1922, where he would have representatives to represent the UNIA with special instructions to the Secretary General, Sir Eric Drummond, of the objectives of the UNIA that was beginning to agitate the colonial powers of France and Britain, who were beginning to see Garvey as a threat to their economic interests. But Garvey's influence was not just ringing in the ears of blacks. There were others who were taking note. The US military sprayed millions of acres of land in Vietnam with Agent Orange in the 1960s, when the world's greatest superpower was defeated by peasants. Even though US troops are receiving compensation for the damage caused by that deadly poison, to this very day, the poison that has been left in the soil and in the waters of Vietnam has left many children being born with some serious defects and deformities, some of them even being born without eyes. Unless you have experienced a war for yourself, you will never know what people go through. We only get the one-sided, sanitized view of the conflict in the news. There is also a generation of fatherless children who are outcast in the country that they were born in because they were either mixed or their mothers were prostitutes. And the United States government was fighting against an ideology they helped to promote in Russia, Marxist-Leninist communism. Was this blowback? They were at war against the late Ho Chi Minh, who helped to create the Communist Republic of Vietnam in the north, who is still a controversial figure to this very day. To many, he was a liberator, a revolutionary, a patriot, a hero, who championed the cause of the downtrodden Vietnamese peasants from French Catholic colonial rule. To others, he was a brutal autocrat who mercilessly murdered innocent people and purged dissidents. While in France, closely surveillanced by the French police, this photo of him in 1920 shows him swearing allegiance to an ideology that developed in London, England, Leninism. But that wasn't his only inspiration. In a book on his life by a man who was a young US station officer stationed at the US Embassy in Saigon in Vietnam, he documented who Ho Chi Minh's other influence was. Ho Chi Minh's visit to America remains one of the most mysterious and puzzling periods of his entire life. He spent a period of time in New York City, found time to attend meetings of black activists such as the Universal Negro Improvement Trust in Harlem, an organization founded under the sponsorship of the famous Jamaican-born black nationalist Marcus Garvey. Many years later, he told a delegation of peace activists who were visiting Hanoi at the height of the Vietnam War that he had been strongly moved by the plight of black peoples around the world and had contributed generously to the movement. If Garvey's ideas had that level of influence, then he had to be stopped at all costs. And a US law enforcement agency in his embryonic period started to surveillance him and his organization, for they could not afford to let that level of influence grow throughout the United States and the rest of the world. Who are they?
Hi, my name is Jim Comey. I'm the director of the FBI. Thank you for visiting this website.
If you go onto a search engine and type in the words FBI and Marcus Garvey and click return, at the top of the search results, when you click, you will enter the official website of the FBI. As you scroll through, you will find stacks and stacks of declassified files of this bureau when it was closely monitoring Marcus Garvey and had him under close surveillance. The man whose career was built on Marcus Garvey was a young law student by the name of John Edgar Hoover. When he joined the Department of Justice in July 1917 at 22 years old, he worked for the Bureau of Investigation, founded in 1908, later changed to the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 1935, where he became its head in 1924. And this counter-radical specialist had a pet obsession with Marcus Garvey. It was by monitoring Garvey that he specialized his craft into a surveillance program in the 1960s called COINTELPRO. What was its aim? The FBI file tells us that it was to prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify and electrify the militant black nationalist movement. Marcus Garvey's son, who appealed to President Barack Hussein Obama to clear his father's name in 2016, said his father started the movement that led to the career path of J. Edgar Hoover.
The civil rights movement started with Marcus Garvey. That's acknowledged by Brother Malcolm, it's acknowledged by Martin Luther King, and it's acknowledged by anybody who knows history.
The man who was born Malcolm Little, later known as Malcolm X, who was under FBI surveillance, grew up in a household where his parents, Louise Little on the left, his mother, and his father, Earl Little on the right, were one of the most zealous Garveyites in the United States. In the first chapter of his autobiography, Malcolm X said when describing his parents, "Louise Little, my mother, was born in Grenada in the British West Indies. My father, the Reverend Earl Little, was from Reynolds, Georgia, a Baptist minister, a dedicated organizer for Marcus Aurelius Garvey's UNIA. With the help of such disciples as my father, Garvey from his headquarters in New York's Harlem was raising the banner of black race purity and exhorting the Negro masses to return to their ancestral African homeland, a cause which had made Garvey the most controversial black man on earth." Malcolm X attended his UNIA meetings with his father. When Martin Luther King Jr. paid a visit to Jamaica, he told them that Marcus Garvey laid the foundation for the civil rights movement. He was also heavily monitored by the FBI, where his inner circle was flooded with men on the FBI payroll that included his own personal photographer, who was spying on Martin Luther King for J. Edgar Hoover, as recent documents have revealed. The Black Panther Party was also surveillanced by the FBI under COINTELPRO. One of its co-founders, Huey Newton, in his book To Die for the People, tells us that Panther ideology was built on Marxist-Leninism communism, ideologies that were developed in London, England. And the clenched fist symbol of the Panthers, that many hailed as Black Power or Power to the People, was actually from communism, where in communist China they used a clenched fist as a symbol of Marxism, as well as the communism that was in parts of Europe that included France. The Panther Eldridge Cleaver, in his book Soul on Ice, mentions that Garvey, who in the first quarter of the century sparked a black mass movement in America, but international in scope and potential. He was also aware of Garvey's influence, but the Black Panther Party was heavily infiltrated by men on the FBI payroll. Fred Hampton was known as the best organizer in the whole of the Black Panther Party. His personal bodyguard was Hugh O'Neill. At the young age of 21, Fred Hampton was gunned down by the Chicago police while he slept in his bed. His bedroom was riddled with bullets on his blood-soaked bed. But how did they know exactly where he slept? All of the details and the layout of his house and where he slept was given to the FBI by Hugh O'Neill, the bodyguard of Fred Hampton. J. Edgar Hoover learned that the most effective way of destroying black leaders is by using black people, for they would never suspect that their own race would be a snitch, and he learned that from monitoring Marcus Garvey, where FBI agents like African-American Thomas Jefferson in 1922 was monitoring Garvey for Hoover, and Earl F. Titus on the left and Arthur Lower Brent on the right worked as undercover agents in the 1920s to sabotage the work of the UNIA. But there was another agent far more dangerous than the others. He was so successful that he made the front cover of the October 1947 edition of Ebony magazine with a machine gun in his hand as one of Hoover's G-men. His name was James E. Amos, and he served President Teddy Roosevelt for 12 years as a personal attendant, confidant, and bodyguard. And he also infiltrated Marcus Garvey and his Black Star Line steamship company. Marcus Garvey was fully aware of who he was and his dangerous methods of infiltration and defamation of character, and Garvey mentioned the FBI agent as one of his most deadly opponents. Garvey said that Amos, a colored man of the Department of Justice who brags he can have anything done because he was bodyguard to the honored and deceased President Theodore Roosevelt, unconstitutionally and wickedly went from home to home and place to place among colored people, and he is still doing so, stirring up hatred and adverse feeling against me, and inspiring individuals to act as to bring about my conviction and my downfall. Witnesses were even promised a return of their investments if they could testify against me. On the opening day of trial, this man was heard to state to a U.S. Marshal stationed at the entrance of the court door immediately after the prosecutor had delivered his opening address to the jury See, I have started my fireworks. Harry M. Doherty was also a high official in the US government. He was the United States Attorney General, who saw Garvey as a threat and wanted to make sure that he brought him down. He also worked for the Department of Justice, and this is how he described Garvey and his movement. The UNIA is composed chiefly of the most primitive and ignorant element of West Indian and American Negroes. The so-called respectable element of the movement are largely ministers without churches, physicians without patients, lawyers without clients, and publishers without readers, who are usually in search of easy money. In short, this organization is composed in the main of Negro sharks and ignorant Negro fanatics. Were these really the type of people Marcus Mosiah Garvey attracted to his movement? Well, let's see. The Online Encyclopedia of Arkansas, a southern U.S. state, mentions one of its most famous sons, William LaVaughn Sherrill, a Pan-Africanist who helped lay the foundation for the African-American social struggle. He was an African-American intellectual, son of a Methodist Episcopal minister, a businessman and a member of the professional class, who joined the UNIA in 1921 and became the Assistant President General in 1922. This monument in Belize in Central America is dedicated to Mr. Isaiah Emmanuel Morta, a descendant of the Igbo in Nigeria who was a member of the UNIA. But what made this man unique to have his monument erected? He was Belize's first black self-made millionaire, who was nicknamed Guinea Sugar. And while in New York, he spent some time with Marcus Garvey before his health deteriorated. In his will, he left 2/3 of his fortune to the UNIA, equivalent to $100,000. In Guyana, in the northeastern part of South America, the Honorable Reverend R.H. Tobit was the UNIA High Commissioner for British Guyana, who had a BA. The man who titled himself Prince Kojo was born Mark Tuvalu Hueno and was nicknamed the Garvey of Europe. Born in modern-day Benin, having a wealthy father, he acquired French citizenship and was a trained barrister, a writer, a minor celebrity in Paris, and served as a doctor for the French armed forces during World War I. He was the nephew of Bahanzin, his mother's brother, who was the last independent king of Dahomey, modern-day Benin, before it became a French colony in the late 19th century Franco-Dahomey War, where he lived in exile in Martinique in the Caribbean and in Algeria in North Africa. This picture was taken in 1924 by Harlem photographer James Vanderdy. Prince Kojo is seated in the center. UNIA member George O. Mark, who went to the League of Nations in 1922, is standing on the left, and Marcus Garvey stands on the right. Men and women dressed very slick in the 1920s. It looked like everyone was dressed to the nine. But this is how far Marcus Garvey's influence was, but there were others who made the UNIA really grow. The former mayor of Washington, D.C., the Honorable Agent Fenty, officially made August 25, 2008 Henrietta Vinton Davis Day in memory of a forgotten, hard-working heroine who worked with the abolitionist movement of Frederick Douglass, as the certificate affirms. And Sheila Dixon, the former mayor of Baltimore, the following year also designated August 25, 2009 as Henrietta Vinton Davis Day. Who is this woman? On her grave, Lady Henrietta Vinton Davis is described as an actress, elocutionist, UNI leader, and a diplomat. At 15, she taught public schools in Maryland, and she was the first African-American woman employed by the Office of the Recorder of the Deeds in Washington, D.C. As an actress, she was introduced at a performance by Frederick Douglass, the former slave turned American social reformer, and she was the intellectual link between the abolition movement of Frederick Douglass, who she worked with, and the Pan-African movement of Marcus Garvey. She was not only the president and vice president of the Black Star Line Shipping Company and second vice president of the Shipping Corporation, but as the UNIA's first international organizer, she established divisions in Cuba, Guadeloupe, St. Thomas, Virgin Islands, Haiti, Trinidad and Tobago, and Jamaica, and was Secretary General of a UNIA delegation that was sent to Liberia in West Africa in 1924 to expand its vision. She was the only person in the UNIA that Marcus Garvey trusted, for she was one of the major backbones of the movement, where along with William Sherrill, who she is sitting with in the back of this car, she was one of the signatures of the Declaration of Rights of Negro Peoples of the World, a sort of Bill of Rights for black people. Henrietta Vinton Davis also introduced black dolls in the 1920s for black children. The UNIA believed that black children should have dolls that reflected them, so that they would not suffer with inferiority complexes in later life. This may have seemed extreme and very over the top to many black and white people, but two Howard-educated psychologists, a couple, Mamie Phipps Clark and Kenneth Clark, conducted an experiment 2 decades later in the 1940s with black children all over the United States to see how they would react to black and white dolls, and the majority of black children automatically gravitated towards the white dolls. While many may think this was a one-off experiment, it is clear that the UNIA knew what they were doing, for in the 21st century, in the United States and in Italy in Europe, children still respond the same way.
I got messages from black moms who said that their daughters didn't want to play with black dolls because they didn't think they were as beautiful as the white dolls. And then seeing my girls playing so happily with their black dolls made them feel better about it.
Quale bambola è bianca? Quale bambola è nera? Quale delle due è bella?
Questa.
Qual è quella bella? Qual è quella brutta? Quale è cattiva? Qual è buona? Perché è cattiva?
Perché è tutto nero.
There are many who question whether children should be tested on race from such an early age. For the black children in Italy do look very troubled indeed. But the UNIA knew what they were doing. They were trying to prevent blacks from a young age in having an identity crisis. For self-hatred can make you very biased towards your own race and respond more violently to something that looks just like you. And Henrietta Vinton Davis in 1920 established the Universal African Black Cross Nurses that was modelled after the Red Cross. They were trained nurses that dressed in all white that provided free healthcare, advice and education because the black community did not receive equal health training. These nurses spread throughout Central and South America, the Caribbean, what was started in the United States beginning in Harlem in New York. For even at the end of the 20th century, black men in Harlem had lower mortality rates not only than other blacks and whites in the United States, but even among Bangladeshis, men who lived in one of the world's poorest nations. Henrietta Davis and William Sherrill also distributed bags of food to the black poor in the neighborhoods, and this was later to be revived in the 1960s with the Black Panther Party and their 10-point program, who also distributed food to the black community and offered free healthcare by well-trained medical doctors and nurses who catered for those in the black community who still don't trust the medical industry. Henrietta Vinton Davis also introduced the juvenile division that empowered young girls from a young age in sewing, studying the Bible, hygiene and domestic science, and black history lessons on Africa. And for the older women was created the Universal African Motor Corps that gave black women a sense of belonging so they can feel a part of a strong community and will not lack self-esteem. Why would Garvey's UNIA go out of their way to empower black women from a very early age? Was there a reason for it? An online survey was conducted to see what people's racial preference was in dating. It was done by OkCupid, and the data showed that black women were the least desired racial group and gender on the entire planet to be picked for a date. But why is that? This plaster cast is of a South African woman. Her name was Sarah Baartman, who, while alive, was paraded around Europe in exhibitions and freak shows to prove Darwin's theory of inferior races because she had a very big bottom and very big breasts. But men like Yves Saint Laurent, the late French fashion designer, wanted to change people's perceptions by being the first to introduce black models in fashion shows in the 1960s. And in 2008, Vogue magazine dedicated an issue to black models on its front cover as a gesture to say that racism does not exist in fashion. More recently, 2 photographers have been working on projects to show that there is beauty in all of the races. For in every racial group, they each think that they are better looking or superior than all the others, which is foolishness. I wonder who made them feel that they were God. But whether we want to admit it or not, European beauty is the set standard for the world. Just type in beautiful women on Google and see which race comes up the most frequent. And other races that includes black women model themselves after the Eurocentric look. But in Asia, European colonialism has left a deeper impression than anywhere else on earth, where in India, all the top models are all light-skinned, and they use skin lightening creams to make their skin more pale and more white, which is quite strange because whites go on holiday to get tans to make their skin more dark. And in the Far East, there are even skin lightening cream adverts that shows black skin as a sign of ugliness that caused quite a lot of controversy, but it shows how ingrained the thinking is. And when Ariana Miyamoto, who won Miss Universe in 2015 representing Japan, she received online criticism by the Japanese for being a hafu and not a full-blooded Japanese, for her mother is Japanese and her father is African American, though she was born in Japan. When this model won Miss France in 2014, she also received a lot of racist abuse. For though she is half white, they didn't believe her face should represent France. But even in the black community, black women have been degraded, especially via the hip-hop culture, who have treated women as nothing more than sexual objects and whores. But what may shock people is that women allow themselves to be degraded. For the woman who is in red, who is standing in the background, LaShauna Stanley, has a modeling agency who provides the women to be in some of the most sexually graphic videos. And if you carefully look at music videos coming from the United States over the years, you may observe that the women tend to be all of one complexion. They're all light-skinned, and it does cause a problem. For when the narrator over the years would invite light-skinned women to church, you could see the dark-skinned women giving them dirty looks. Many will say it is the music industry's fault, but I totally disagree. Rosa Parks, who is light-skinned, is one of the iconic figures of the civil rights freedom movement, famous for not giving up her seat to a white passenger. But she was not the first. Newsweek magazine says before Rosa Parks, there was Claudette Colvin. She was a lot darker skinned than Rosa Parks, but for some strange reason, she has been overlooked and nobody even knows about her. Why is that? The New York Times said instead of being celebrated, Miss Colvin has lived unheralded in the Bronx for decades, initially cast off by black leaders who feared she was not the right face for their battle. Or to be blunt, she was too dark to be used to represent the struggle of the black community. And the reason why Henrietta Vinton Davis, who was very light-skinned and could pass for white, and Marcus Garvey, who was very dark-skinned and descendant of the Maroons, created these empowering groups for both black men and women was to avoid all that ridiculous complexion bickering among blacks. But this dream of a black world empire was to be short-lived, for Garvey did not just have enemies within the US government. His greatest enemy was himself, for he took advice from no one. And where no counsel is, the people fall. But in the multitude of counselors there is safety. And while many Garvey fans are adamant that the white establishment single-handedly brought him down, Garvey said that his most deadly opponents were not whites, but blacks. For jealousy, a characteristic trait that humanity has sadly inherited from the fallen cherub, the son of the morning. Though it has affected all races, in the black community it is known as the crab mentality, where once an individual strives to succeed in life, others attempt to discourage them and hinder their growth. And Garvey described this mentality as thus: most of the troubles I have had in advancing the cause of the race have come from the Negroes. The greatest stumbling block in the way of progress in the race has invariably come from within the race itself. Having had the wrong education at the start in his racial career, the Negro has become his greatest enemy. Booker Washington aptly described the race in one of his lectures by stating, "We were like crabs in a barrel, that none would allow the other to climb over, but on any such attempts, all would combine to pull back into the barrel the one crab that would make the effort to climb out." I am of the opinion that the group of whites from whom communists are made in America, as well as trade unionists and members of the Workers' Party, is more dangerous to the Negro's welfare than any group at present. The Negro should keep shy of communism or the Workers' Party in America. Karl Marx, whose ideas spread global after his death, is what the US-led Cold War was in aid of, to crush it. Marx, who believed in preserving the forced labor and servitude of the black race and was against the abolition of slavery, may have been surprised, if he was alive during the Cold War, to see that these same blacks would embrace his ideas as their worldview. The humanist ideas of Marxism attracted black intellectuals in North America and in the Caribbean, where the sickle and the hammer became a recruitment drive for descendants of slaves that made them even more of a target by Western powers. And atheistic communism made these blacks' hearts more hardened and very hostile to Christianity. Now, why is that? There are photographs after the Emancipation Proclamation from the southern states of North America of white men, women and children with dead corpses of black people hanging from a rope like they are game from a hunt. Some of these blacks were even killed for whistling at a white woman. The photos look very eerie and unsettling, for this was an era called the Bible Belt, the Protestant stronghold of the United States, so-called devout Christians. Were these Southerners, who were mostly of English descent, aware of the rich heritage that they inherited, that from left to right men like Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, John Rogers and Archbishop Thomas Cranmer were all martyrs in 16th century England who gave their life so that the English people could be free from ecclesiastical tyranny? Did these martyrs' descendants actually know what is a Protestant? The best authority, Scottish historian J.A. Wiley, tells us that it is true, no doubt, that Protestantism, strictly viewed, is simply a principle. It is not a policy. It is not an empire having its fleets and armies, its officers and tribunals, wherewith to extend its dominion and make its authority obeyed. It is not even a church with its hierarchies and synods and edicts. It is simply a principle. But it is the greatest of all principles. It is a creative power. It penetrates into the heart and renews the individual. In a word, Protestantism is revived Christianity, says Wiley. Today, factions of Donald Trump supporters have shifted from that position and have racialized Protestantism like their new swinging forebears.
I think in the United States was defined by Anglo-Protestants, certainly at the beginning, but particularly after the Civil War, it was defined by this big European family. So America is a white country in terms of its rooted historical identity.
And because a racialized identity has dominated many aspects of North American Protestantism, Communist Russia took advantage of that Christian hypocrisy and produced posters to recruit blacks over to communist ideology, even though it was more propaganda instead of a sincere desire to liberate blacks, as Marcus Garvey said. And Garvey's strongest opponents were communist blacks who were, from left to right, men like James W. Ford, Asa Philip Randolph, and Chandler Owen. And Garvey had to increase his bodyguards because of the communists. And in gentrified Dawson in northeast London, there is a library named after another one of Garvey's most fiercest opponents, C.L.R. James, where in Brixton in southeast London, he lived and he died. Cyril Lionel Robert James was a Trinidadian journalist and historian who embraced communism, then later socialism, who is famous for the book The Black Jacobins, the best documented work on the Haitian Revolution. He also temporarily met Wall Street-funded Leon Trotsky in Mexico, where they discussed communism and the Negro question. C.L.R. James's childhood friend in Trinidad was also a very strong opponent of Marcus Garvey. His name was George Padmore. He also lived in England for a while, and was also a political advisor to Ghana President Kwame Nkrumah. He also became a communist in his thinking, and William Z. Edward Foster, an American communist, took him to Russia, where for a while he worked for Joseph Stalin until he fell out with him over his purges in his government. But George Padmore, who viewed Garvey as promoting Negro Zionism, said, "The struggle against Garveyism represents one of the major tasks of Negro workers in America and in the colonies of Africa and the Caribbean. Garveyism is alien to the best interests of Negro workers. Negro workers must understand that the only road by which they can acquire freedom and emancipation is by organizing their forces and establishing an alliance with white workers." A staunch female Garvey apologetic said, "The US Communist Party, directly under the orders of the Communist Internationale, was more than once implicated in the harassment of the UNIA members. Goons of the US Communist Party broke up the UNIA meetings with physical violence." Chiefly through the voice of George Padmore, a then prominent black figurehead in the Communist Internationale, Marxists throughout the world were urged to vigorously uproot Garveyism. Also to be found in the ranks of the prominent black anti-Garvey stooges of the left during the 1920s and 1930s was the Trinidadian left-wing assimilationist C.L.R. James, alias J.R. Johnson. C.L.R. James, who was affiliated with the Trotskyist brand of Marxism, an offshoot of the Communist Internationale, became notorious for his vicious attacks against Garvey and the UNIA. She had no love for these men at all. But Marcus Garvey was to do something that he was totally unaware was the right ammunition his enemies needed to get rid of him, but he still made no regrets about doing it. Though he had a strong US support base, he was still viewed as an outsider. In the English newspaper, The Telegraph, it documented that many American blacks distrusted Caribbean immigrants. A flourishing black middle-class neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, nicknamed the Black Wall Street, was economically independent, but it was to come under siege from the neighboring white community, who could not tolerate in seeing blacks flourishing and becoming even more prosperous than the whites. And it took one little spark to start a race riot, and they burnt the whole place down, even bombing it from planes in the air. This was in June in 1921. But what drove them to commit that horrific act? 6 years earlier in the White House, on March 21st, 1915, the 28th US President, Woodrow Wilson, had a private screening of a film that he praised for being a historical masterpiece, even though it was historically inaccurate. It was called Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffiths, and it is a film that is still praised as a cinematic masterpiece The film even quotes President Wilson, which is clear government endorsement, and it portrays blacks of the South as violent, hypersexual imbeciles, and it falsified the reality of Reconstruction by brainwashing whites that blacks are going to take over the country. That is why whites rioted in Tulsa, in Oklahoma. And its clever propaganda's aim was to unite whites in the North and in the South on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. It was a promotion and glamorization of the white state terror of the Ku Klux Klan. But what may shock you is that Garvey's UNIA and the Ku Klux Klan joined forces and worked together, for Garvey believed in racial purity and in transferring blacks back to Africa, and the Ku Klux Klan wanted a racially pure white America. They had another thing in common. Garvey appointed an Antiguan-born bishop, George Alexander Maguire, as a spiritual chaplain for the UNIA. You cannot mix Jesus and promote racial purity. And the Ku Klux Klan also, in quotes, were Protestant, who would also misuse the Bible. Garvey would have meetings with Edward Young Clark, who was the Imperial Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. He later testified against Garvey according to declassified FBI files. Garvey also closely worked with Theodore Bilbo, a Klansman and governor of Mississippi. And he was also a personal friend of white supremacist Ernest Sevier Cox, one of the strongest campaigners for racial segregation, who wrote the book White America about preserving a racially pure America, and along with a fellow Virginian, John Powell, who Garvey allowed to lecture at UNIA meetings, they passed the Virginia Racial Integrity Act of 1924. But what did it entail?
In here?
Richard!
What you doing in bed with that woman?
I'm his wife.
That's no good here.
Richard Perry Loving being a white person and Mildred Jeter being a colored person did unlawfully cohabitate as man and wife.
Richard?
That ain't right!
The state of Virginia will argue that it is unfair to bring children of mixed race into the world.
Tell that woman to come out here.
Garvey's UNIA said that our members are reading and studying White America, and many of the members have said that White America should be in every Negro's house alongside the Bible. That's crazy. This is black people endorsing white supremacy ideology. Garvey said that between the Ku Klux Klan and the Morphle Story National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, give me the Klan for their honesty of purpose towards the Negro. Mr. John Powell of the Anglo-Saxon Clubs of America represents a body of men and women for whom I maintain the greatest respect because of their honesty and the lack of hypocrisy. They are honest and honorable in their desire to purify and preserve the white race, even as we are determined to purify and standardize our race. I feel and believe that we, the two organizations, should work together for the purpose of bringing about the ideal sort, the purification of the races, their autonomous separation, and the unbridled freedom of self-development and self-expression. Those who are against this are enemies of both races and rebels against morality, nature, and God. He was so convicted that he was in the right. But a West Indian in the United States of America, endorsing the Ku Klux Klan, whose members burnt down an African American community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, was not a wise move, and he was going to create even more enemies. The civil rights organization, the NAACP, was founded mostly by Jews, Morphle Story being its founding president. It was financed by wealthy Jews like Joel Spingarn, and Walter Francis White, sitting on the bottom row second from left, is a very light-skinned African American. Next to him on the right is William Pickens. William Pickens was a journalist, and the letter on the right is an invitation from Garvey in July 1922 to a UNIA meeting. But Pickens responded and said, "I'd rather be a plain black American fighting in the ranks against the Klan than all its brood than to be the imperial wizard of the Ku Klux or the allied imperial blizzard of the UNIA. Garvey created a problem. James Weldon Johnson was another NAACP member who Garvey had a dialogue with. He did attempt to work with them, but his meddling with the Klan damaged his influence, and Garvey was told by a journalist that James Weldon Johnson was spreading false rumors about him, in a letter Garvey had written and sent to him addressing it. But William E.B. Du Bois, the NAACP's most prominent spokesman, at first was highly respected by Garvey. If you read the letters of correspondence, you can see that Garvey reached out, but Du Bois would turn down invitations. But he did do a write-up in The Crisis, the NAACP's journal, about Garvey and the UNIA. And if you read the article very carefully, most of it is very critical, especially of Garvey's mismanagement of funds. And because of that, Marcus, whose name means Mars, the Roman god of war, and William, whose name is German for resolute protector, became very bitter enemies. W.E.B. Du Bois, who was communist in his thinking, in his autobiography is adamant that he had nothing at all to do with Marcus Garvey being sent to jail. Who knows? But Garvey, through the workings of J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, eventually did go to jail on apparently mail fraud charges. Marcus Garvey had the best lawyer in New York, George Gordon Battle, but that still didn't save him. In the Royal Albert Hall in South Kensington in London, England, Marcus Garvey gave a lecture on June 6, 1928, giving his reason why he believed the US government jailed him, and this is what he said. There was a great rubber shortage from 1922 up till 1925 on the part of the Americans. You English had cornered the rubber market. You had all the rubber plantations under your control in the Malay Peninsula. The Americans had no rubber reserve. Mr. Hoover acted as foster father for all American rubber interests. Just about that time, my organization had completed an agreement with the Liberian government to place at our disposal 4 sections of the little country of Liberia so that we could start our experiment in helping to build Liberia and make her worthy of a worthwhile Negro state in Africa. After we had everything ready, Firestone's agent found out that it was possible to grow rubber in Liberia. He, therefore, influenced the president of Liberia, Charles King, the man who had entered into a secret agreement with us, to abrogate the contract between his government and my organization, and to place at his Firestone's disposal the land that was given to our organization. They also gave Firestone 1 million acres of land, which they placed at our disposal for colonial purposes. Firestone was backed by Mr. Hoover, the Secretary of Commerce in America. Therefore, you will understand that it was convenient at that time, in 1924, to rush me to prison, because just at that time I was able to make not only trouble for Charles King, but for Firestone for double-crossing us in Liberia. In order for the American automobile industry to function, it needed tires for its cars. Without tires, no cars, no industry, and Britain controlled the rubber monopoly. It was the multi-billionaire businessman industrialist Henry Ford who revolutionized the automobile industry and changed the landscape of the 20th century. But how was he able to keep that mass production going? On the official website of the White House, it mentions Herbert Hoover, who was the 31st president in one term from 1929 to 1933. But as Secretary of Commerce, he expanded the department's foreign trade activities, being successful as a mining engineer. And he was the mastermind of sealing a rubber deal in Liberia on behalf of Harvey Samuel Firestone, the American businessman who founded one of the first global markets of automobile tires named after him, Firestone Tire and Rubber Company. There are many who love to use the race card and will say that Marcus Garvey was targeted because he was black, but that is not true. He clashed with the economic interests of corporate conglomerates in the United States. And this photo shows from left to right Herbert Hoover, Henry Ford, Thomas Edison and Harvey Firestone, who supplied the tires to Henry Ford Motor Company. So Marcus Garvey was up against an economic juggernaut. He didn't have a chance. They would have outmaneuvered him. Money talks. The Republic of Liberia is a West African country that became a home for free-born American blacks who migrated there in the 19th century with the help of the American Colonization Society. And Garvey's UNIA Black Star Line ships sent a delegation there to help build up Liberia, but they refused to continue their mission, for Charles King, the president of Liberia, overrode the deal he made with Marcus Garvey and gave the United States a huge slice of Liberia, where he continued business with Firestone while he was in office, so that America can keep its automobile industry running. When you come to conflict with the corporate interests of the United States, then you have had it. And the acres of land that was first offered to Garvey was now at the use of the disposal of corporate America, where till this very day, rubber is still extracted from the trees and Firestone still has a stake in Liberia, and was also implicated in the dirty Liberian War that spread into diamond-rich Sierra Leone, where people lost limbs. But under President Calvin Coolidge, Marcus Garvey was incarcerated. But as he was in ill health, suffering from bronchial asthma, if he was to die in jail, he would become a martyr and it would electrify the UNIA. So released him early. He was deported back to Jamaica, where 500 blacks stood in the rain to bid him farewell from New Orleans in November 1927. He found no luck in continuing his vision in Jamaica, so he made his way to London, in Kensington, where he attempted to resuscitate his dream of a black empire. When you come out of West Kensington Station, take a left and the second road on the left, you will come to a road named Beaumont Crescent. It was here that he continued the UNIA, and his name, now fading, is on the left of the front door, and on the right is a plaque dedicated to the organization that was once run from that building. But this dream was to be short-lived, for on Tolgarth Road, hemmed in from the rise of another war, and unable to communicate his ideas to the outside world, Marcus Mosiah Garvey Jr. died from a second stroke in 1940 at the age of 52. His dream of a Kushite utopia died with him. His body was taken to Kensal Green Cemetery in West London, but he did not receive a burial. His body was interned within the lower crypt that is underneath the church. His name and burial number is still on the books, number 132.119. His body was later transferred to Jamaica. There are many people who revere Garvey till this very day, but his vision would never have been a reality, and here are the reasons why. Marcus Garvey gave himself the title of the first provisional president of Africa. This was done without actually consulting first different tribes of Africa, but Africa had dramatically changed since the Garvey era in pre-World War II. The World Economic Forum conducted a study on the economic growth of different regions, and Africa is the second fastest growing continent in the world, with about 6 of the fastest growing economies in the world. But, as it is rich in abundance of minerals, the continent of Asia has capitalized on its vast wealth and natural resources, and many of the indigenous people of Africa do not even benefit of what is under their own soil. Now, why is that? Because Africa's resources, according to CNN, fuel the entire world. Its jewelry consists of half of the world's diamonds, 3/4 of the world's platinum, and 1/5 of its gold. There is black gold, which is petroleum or oil. The electronics we have today, non- and rechargeable batteries, electricity that is made up of coal, gas, and uranium. Most of the world's platinum and rhodium that helps to make cars is from Africa, as well as the jet engines for airplanes come from the metals in Africa. So when you see here or are in a plane, when you are fiddling around with your tablets, when you see an advertisement from Apple advertising their latest products with its intricate designs and rotating metals, when you feel your phone vibrating in your pocket, when you want to know how modern space technology works, they all function from an extracted rock called coltan, a mineral used in space technology and found in eastern Congo. This is how the modern digital world functions. And when the main colonial-driven media focuses on the brutality of guerrillas and militia groups, it is actually the multinationals that fuel the wars. For the US stockpiling policy of 1946 listed the minerals the government needed to survive, and it included that priceless stone from the Congo, cobalt or coltan. Marcus Garvey was fully aware that he was at war with Wall Street, and he said he was a stumbling block to their expanding financial interest in Africa. He said that at the start of my agitation, white statesmen and capitalists holding investments directly or indirectly in the diamond, rubber, ivory, wool, cotton, gold, palm oil and other interests in Africa instructed their newspapers such as the New York Times of New York City, the Manchester Guardian of Manchester, England, and their continental and colonial organs and associate syndicate to cast ridicule upon the idea and portray me as a clown, buffoon, ignoramus, cheat, and impossible person. If the oil of Africa is good for Rockefeller's interest, if iron ore is good to the Carnegie Trust, then surely these minerals are good for us. Why should we allow Wall Street and the capitalist group of America and other countries to exploit our country when they refuse us a fair chance in the country of our adoption? Why should not Africa give to the world its Black Rockefeller, Rothschild, and Henry Ford? Marcus Garvey was unaware that Africa already did have a man who was richer than them all. The video game Sid Meier's Civilization 4 has a character called Mansa Musa, a 14th century West African king who is the richest human being in all history. So there is nothing to actually achieve, for it has already been accomplished. And this was a study that was compiled by Celebrity Net Worth, that he was richer than both the Rothschild family and John D. Rockefeller. So Garvey wanted something that preceded him by centuries. Garvey wanted to revive a golden age that was long gone. It was a dream, not a reality. For even though all libraries and courses are scant on this history, data has shown that blacks already had the first and oldest kings. They built colossal monuments whose mathematical precision still baffles scientists and engineers today. They navigated the sea and built the first empires in Central America and left a number of colossus heads as lasting evidence. So Garvey wanted to achieve something that was already accomplished. But if anyone knows anything about history, civilizations rise, then they fall. That has always been the order of things. In North, Central, and South America, the current indigenous population can no longer build huge complexes in the mountains, overseeing the clouds as in the civilization of Machu Picchu in Peru. Neither can they put huge rocks together and merge the blocks with such mathematical precision. That wisdom is now lost. Can the Nigerians, when visiting the British Museum, carve these same levels of artistic genius from metal and ivory as their medieval forebears? No, because that era is long gone also, and it is an interesting part of history to be observed and studied, but their golden age is over. Marcus Garvey's UNIA's motto was at the top of the paper of his correspondence letters that read, "One God, one aim, one destiny." And it also said he created of one blood all nations of men to dwell on the face of the earth, a quote from Acts chapter 17 and verse 26. But you can't quote a scriptural passage that is catered to every race, then have a movement that is designed for one single race. That is a contradiction in itself. You can't mix Jesus with preserving racial purity. Jesus came to break all those deep-rooted cultural barriers down. In John chapter 4 and verse 9 it reads, "Then saith the woman of Samaria unto him, How is it that thou, being a Jew, ask us drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria, for the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. He was laying a foundation for the disciples. For when a vision was given to both Cornelius, a Gentile, and Peter, a Jew, it records the words of Peter in Acts chapter 10 and verse 28. And he said unto them, Ye know that it is an unlawful thing for a man that is a Jew to keep company or come unto one of another nation. But God hath shewed or showed me that I should not call any man common or unclean. This is a divine pattern. The only sad thing is if only the churches of today would follow that example, they'll draw many people to Christ, for they are still the most racially divided systems on planet Earth. The world clearly sees it, but they still have no interest in changing. But it was Garvey's desire for racial purity that has influenced a lot of modern day black movements. Some still try and cling onto the Bible, but have tried to racialize salvation. The two do not work. God does not deal with man along those lines. In 1 Samuel chapter 16 and verse 7, it reads, But the Lord said unto Samuel, Look not on his countenance, that is his face, or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord seeth not as man seeth. For man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh where? On the heart. But there are others who reject God completely, running back to the pagan idolatry of Africa, and making other blacks feel like sellouts because they are not giving homage to a deified animal that rolls doo-doo. I mean, come on now, it's doo-doo, it smells. That is the foolishness people want to embrace when they want to go back to the worship of nature. The late Dr. Ben was one of the early advocates of this movement. He would fight down the Bible and say it was an allegory. That's a Gnostic argument. But like all the so-called respected black intellectuals, they just hijack white people's arguments and repackage it to the black community like it is an original concept. He followed the teachings of Gerald Macy, the 19th century discredited English poet and writer on spiritualism in ancient Egypt, who just expounded Gnostic philosophy. The modern black Egyptologists also declare that the triad deities of Isis, Horus and Osiris is where the Godhead in the Bible is from. That is a stolen argument from Ralph Cudworth, a 17th century Cambridge-educated English classicist and Platonist. Their arguments have not got one iota of originality in them, just plagiarized ideas that have all been refuted. And even Elijah Muhammad, also an early follower of Garvey, followed the teachings of a white man known to the FBI files as a scam artist, Wallace D. Fard, who taught that the white man is the devil and that Christianity is a white slave master's religion, an argument that many whites still use against blacks to this very day.
I mean, I never understood why black people wanted to adopt the God of the slave master to begin with.
No, it's the exact opposite.
As we draw this study to a close, let us clear up some unchallenged issues. Whenever we hear the name of Jesus, the image that instantly comes into our thoughts is this one. Let's keep it real. Let's not try to be politically correct. You know it's true. Many use this argument to say it is a white man's religion, for the imagery that dominates the Western Hemisphere of Jesus is always a Northern European, and many blacks reject the Bible on these grounds. What is interesting though, is that films over the years that depict ancient Egypt also shows the main characters as Northern Europeans. But do they want to have no part of Egyptian studies because all of the characters are depicted in Hollywood films as white? Interesting. Let us take a trip to the culture of Ethiopia in East Africa that has beautiful churches carved out of solid rock. When visitors around the world visit, they are amazed at this architecture, for it is one of the oldest Christian nations on earth. It had its own kings, who were adorned in brightly colored clothing, and its culture is very rich in history. They had their own Bibles in their own language, which was Ge'ez. But recent evidence has shown that Ethiopia has the world's first illustrated Christian Bible that was discovered in one of its monasteries. They depicted Jesus and the disciples as Ethiopians. For each nation that embraced Christianity, drew the Lord in the image of their culture, just as Europeans also depicted him in the image of their culture. So the white Jesus argument is useless. When the Atlantic slave trade was taking place, many would misquote passages of the Holy Scriptures to justify slavery. One of them was Peter Helene, a 17th century English ecclesiastic who popularized an already existing view, the curse of Ham theory, that taught that Ham was cursed by Noah, therefore the black race is cursed. The only problem with that is that the Bible actually said in Genesis chapter 9 and verse 25, "Cursed be to Canaan and not Ham." The Sons of Loyola, the Jesuits, the spiritual militia of the Roman Catholic Church, also tried to use scripture to justify the practice of slavery. A book was written by Reverend Raymond Harris, a Spanish Jesuit who lived in Liverpool in the north of England, who tried to use the Holy Scriptures to justify slavery. But Olaudah Equiano, an Igbo of Nigeria, a slave who obtained his freedom and lived in London, England, refuted this Jesuit's argument, and he quoted a passage that critics overlook that is in the New Testament concerning how masters should treat their slaves. Philemon 16 says, "Not now as a servant, but above a servant, a brother, beloved, especially to me, but how much more unto thee, both in the flesh and in the Lord." So the New Testament teaches that slaves should be treated as a brother. And Colossians 4 verse 1 says, "Masters, give unto your servants that which is just and equal, knowing that you also have a master in heaven." And Ephesians 6 verse 9 says, "And ye masters, do the same thing unto them, forbearing, threatening, or having mercy, understanding, and compassion to your slaves, knowing that your master also is in heaven, neither is the respect of persons with him." These passages from the scriptures are always overlooked and ignored, and the men who came from Europe to Africa with slave ships were interested in making a profit, not in sharing Jesus Christ. There are a number of questions that go unanswered. What is an African king, Taharka of the Sudan, doing in a white man's book, the Bible? There is silence in the black conscious camp. And what about the book of Jeremiah? It mentions Pharaoh Necho of the 26th dynasty of Egypt. Not bad for a slave master's book. It also records the invasion of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, that Nebuchadnezzar also recorded on a tablet that is on display in the British Museum. Archaeologists also unearthed this clay bulla of Baruch, who was Jeremiah's scribe, that shows the Bible is historically accurate. But who was the only one that came to Jeremiah's aid when he was left to die, and he pleaded to the king? Then the king commanded Ebed-melech the Ethiopian, saying, "Take from hence 30 men with thee, and take up Jeremiah the prophet out of the dungeon before he die." Jeremiah chapter 38 and verse 10. A black man was the only one who boldly stood up in the court of Judah. Not bad for a white man's religion. So the question I leave with you: black consciousness versus Christ's righteousness, or the philosophy of man versus the word of God? That is a choice I will leave to you. You can now take off your seatbelts. Feel free to subscribe to the Even at the Doors YouTube channel, where you'll receive regular videos. And you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter by clicking on the links below. I would just like to thank all those who have sent donations that have kept this ministry afloat. And if you would like to continue to support this work, also click on the link below. If you would like to see this work spread even further, you have permission to distribute this video for non-commercial or commercial use on the condition that you do not add or take away from the content of this study. Thank you.